Every time a crime dominates the headlines, every time a jury delivers a verdict, every time a community tries to understand what happened, the same word gets used: evil. It is the word that ends conversations, the word that feels like an explanation when no other explanation seems adequate, the word that separates the person who did the thing from every person who did not. Psychology has a problem with that word, not because it is offensive, not because it is insensitive, but because it is inaccurate. And clinical inaccuracy in a forensic context has consequences. The clinical literature on criminal psychology draws a clear and specific distinction between what the public calls evil and what the research actually identifies. That distinction is what this analysis covers, and once you understand it, the word will never work the same way again. Classification, conceptual misidentification. Subject, the clinical distinction between evil as a cultural construct and mental illness as a diagnostic category. Present day, every jurisdiction, every criminal case that receives public attention. What makes this subject psychologically unique is not that it is controversial. It is that the distinction is not actually controversial within clinical psychology at all. Forensic psychologists, clinical psychiatrists, criminologists, the research community that studies criminal behavior professionally, reached a clear consensus on this question decades ago. The public and the media have not yet received that memo. The behavioral evidence suggests the gap between what psychology knows and what the public believes about this distinction is one of the most consequential misunderstandings in the entire field of criminal justice. The word evil has a very specific function in criminal cases. It is used to signal that normal explanatory frameworks do not apply, that the act was so far outside the range of human behavior that ordinary psychological analysis, the tools that explain why ordinary people do ordinary things, are simply inadequate. The word evil says, this person is categorically different from us, different in kind, not just in degree. A different species of human, operating by different rules, motivated by something outside the normal architecture of psychology. This belief has enormous appeal. It provides an explanation that requires no further investigation. It provides emotional closure, and it provides something else: the reassurance that what happened could not happen in any life recognizable as normal. Psychology's objection to this is not moral. It is methodological. Evil is not a diagnostic category. It is not in the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that defines every clinical psychological condition recognized by the field. It appears in no risk assessment tool. It is not referenced in any sentencing guideline framework. It is not a variable that any forensic instrument measures, because evil is a moral and theological concept, not a clinical one. Now here is where the research becomes specifically important. The most common application of the evil label in criminal cases is in cases where the perpetrator appears to have no comprehensible motive, where the violence is extreme, where remorse is absent, where the person seems disconnected from normal human feeling. The public assumption is that this profile, extreme violence, apparent absence of remorse, apparent disconnection from normal emotion, must indicate mental illness. The research shows the opposite. The MacArthur Violence Risk Assessment Study, one of the most comprehensive longitudinal studies of violence and mental illness ever conducted, followed over 1,000 individuals discharged from psychiatric facilities and tracked their rates of violent behavior against a comparison community sample. The findings are unambiguous. People with serious mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depression, are not significantly more likely to commit violent acts against strangers than members of the general population without mental illness. When substance abuse is removed as a variable, the difference in violence rates between people with mental illness and people without mental illness is not statistically significant. More importantly, the profile that the public associates with dangerous mental illness, the unpredictable stranger who attacks without provocation or relationship, accounts for a statistically very small proportion of all violent crime. People with serious mental illness are significantly more likely to be the victims of violent crime than the perpetrators of it. If mental illness does not explain the profile the public calls evil, what does? That is the question forensic psychology has spent 50 years answering. The behavioral evidence suggests that the confusion between evil and mental illness is not simply a public misunderstanding. It is a structural failure in how the conversation about crime is framed. When media coverage of violent crime conflates mental illness with dangerousness, two consequential errors occur simultaneously. The first, people with genuine mental illness are incorrectly stigmatized as dangerous when the research consistently shows they are not. The second, the actual psychological profiles that do predict dangerous behavior are misidentified, misunderstood, and frequently missed entirely by systems designed to detect and intervene. Forensic psychology distinguishes between four distinct categories that are routinely collapsed into the single word evil. Understanding these distinctions is not academic. It is the difference between identifying risk and missing it entirely. Distinction 1. Serious mental illness. Serious mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, major depressive disorder, schizoaffective disorder, is characterized by disturbances in perception, cognition, mood, or thought processes that significantly impair functioning. The forensic relevance of serious mental illness is its potential impact on criminal responsibility, specifically, whether a person understood the nature of their actions, and whether they understood those actions were legally or morally wrong at the time they occurred. The critical clinical point is this: the vast majority of violent crime is committed by individuals who do not have serious mental illness, and the vast majority of individuals with serious mental illness do not commit violent crime. The relationship between serious mental illness and violence is far weaker than public perception suggests, and is almost entirely mediated by substance abuse as a co-occurring factor. Distinction 2. Antisocial Personality Disorder. Antisocial Personality Disorder, ASPD, is characterized by a persistent pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others. It involves deceitfulness, impulsivity, irritability, reckless disregard for safety, consistent irresponsibility, and lack of remorse for harm caused to others. ASPD is not psychosis. It is not a disturbance of perception or thought. The person with ASPD understands reality accurately. They understand their actions and their consequences. What they lack is the internal regulatory mechanism that typically prevents people from acting on harmful impulses, specifically the capacity for empathic concern for others. ASPD has a prevalence rate of approximately 3% in the general population. Among prison populations, studies estimate prevalence at 40 to 70%. This is not because criminal behavior causes ASPD. It is because the psychological profile described by ASPD significantly increases the probability of criminal behavior. Distinction 3. Psychopathy. Psychopathy is the clinical construct most closely associated with what the public calls evil, and it is critically distinct from both serious mental illness and from ASPD. Psychopathy, as measured by Robert Hare's Psychopathy Checklist Revised, the PCL-R, involves two distinct factor clusters. Factor 1 encompasses the interpersonal and affective features: glibness, grandiosity, pathological lying, manipulation, shallow affect, lack of remorse, lack of empathy, failure to accept responsibility. Factor 2 encompasses the lifestyle and antisocial features: impulsivity, poor behavioral controls, early behavioral problems, parasitic lifestyle, criminal versatility. The key distinction between psychopathy and serious mental illness is that the psychopathic individual has no disturbance of reality testing. They are not experiencing hallucinations or delusions. They understand the world accurately. They understand other people's suffering accurately. They simply do not care. Psychopathy is not a break from reality. It is a break from conscience. This distinction between a break from reality and a break from conscience is the most important forensic psychological distinction in criminal analysis. A person experiencing a psychotic episode may commit a violent act because they are responding to a distorted perception of reality. The violence is the product of a broken cognitive filter. A high-scoring psychopath who commits a violent act is responding to an accurate perception of reality through a broken moral filter. They know exactly what they are doing. They know exactly what it means. They have simply removed the internal mechanism that in most people functions as a prohibitive constraint. Hare's research identified psychopathy in approximately 1% of the general population. Among incarcerated populations, estimates range from 15 to 25%, a disproportionate representation by any measure. Distinction 4. Moral disengagement. Albert Bandura's 1999 research on moral disengagement provides the fourth and perhaps most significant category, the one that accounts for the largest proportion of serious criminal behavior that is neither serious mental illness nor ASPD nor clinical psychopathy. Moral disengagement describes the psychological mechanisms through which ordinary individuals with normal moral development can commit acts that would normally violate their own internal moral standards, by progressively deactivating the self-regulatory mechanisms that ordinarily function as internal constraints on harmful behavior. The mechanisms of moral disengagement include moral justification, reframing harmful behavior as serving a higher purpose; euphemistic labeling, using language that obscures the harmful nature of acts; advantageous comparison, comparing harmful actions to worse acts to minimize them; displacement of responsibility, attributing actions to authority or circumstance; diffusion of responsibility, distributing moral ownership across a group; dehumanization, stripping victims of human qualities to eliminate empathic response. The critical implication of Bandura's framework is that the capacity for serious harmful behavior is not confined to a small category of clinically abnormal individuals. It is available to any person whose internal regulatory mechanisms are progressively deactivated through the right combination of psychological mechanisms, social context, and environmental conditions. Evil, as the public understands it, requires a monster. Moral disengagement requires only a person. Classification. Conceptual misidentification. Criminal psychology misread as moral category. Primary error. Using evil as explanation terminates analysis before it begins. 4 distinctions. Serious mental illness. Antisocial personality disorder. Psychopathy. Moral disengagement. Risk indicators. 1. Absence of psychosis does not mean absence of risk. 2. The most dangerous profiles are not mentally ill. 3. Moral disengagement operates in ordinary people under the right conditions. Psychological Framework, DSM-5, PCL-R by Robert Hare. The MacArthur Violence Risk Assessment Study. Bandura's Moral Disengagement Framework, 1999. Detection difficulty, high. Cultural framing of evil actively prevents accurate clinical identification of the actual risk profiles present. Dark verdict probability. The word evil has never solved a crime, prevented a crime, or identified a dangerous person. The clinical framework has done all 3. The dark verdict is this: evil is not a psychological category. It is a cultural verdict, delivered at the moment when understanding becomes too difficult, too uncomfortable, or too threatening to continue. The clinical record is consistent and unambiguous. The behaviors that the public labels evil, the extreme violence, the absence of remorse, the apparent disconnection from normal human feeling, are explained by specific, identifiable, measurable psychological constructs, not by a special category of human being that exists outside the range of psychological analysis. Psychopathy is a measurable clinical profile. Antisocial personality disorder is a diagnosable condition. Moral disengagement is a documented psychological process that operates in ordinary human beings under the right conditions. None of these things require evil. What they require is analysis. Rigorous, clinical, uncomfortable, evidence-based analysis of the actual psychological mechanisms at work. The word evil asks us to stop looking. The clinical framework asks us to look harder. In every case where dangerous behavior was predicted, detected, and prevented, it was not the word evil that did it. It was the framework. The mind is the crime scene. Dark verdict confirmed. If this analysis challenged how you think about criminal behavior, the next dark verdict goes further. We examine the 7 psychological reactions your brain generates under threat, and how the most dangerous people in any room have already learned to predict them. Subscribe. It publishes next.